The whine of the bone drill cut through the kill zone louder than the gunfire in Nora Vance's head. It bit into cortical bone with a thin, ugly scream, while the private under her hand bucked against the gravel and torn nylon. Air leaked wetly from the hole in his chest. It was not a clean puncture. It was a pressure problem, and it was going to kill him fast. Tension pneumothorax, if the trapped air won before she did. Blood steamed on her gloves and smelled like hot rust on desert dust. Somebody was calling for smoke. Somebody else was praying in that flat. Efficient way men prayed when they already knew God was busy. Nora leaned harder, found the wound track, and felt splintered rib ends grind under her fingers. The Kevlar panel had split around a star-shaped break where bone had punched outward. Yaw and tumble. Bad angle. Worse bullet. Another round hissed over the basalt and shaved grit across the back of her neck. She did not look up. Looking up was for people without a chest cavity, open under both hands. The valley heat-baked iodine, coffee, and copper stink into the fabric under her armour. Sand scraped across her knuckles. The private's breath came in quick little thefts, each one shallower than the last. Marcus Wade was on the radio behind her, voice cracking under all that officer bark. Drop that fucking bag and fall back. One ranger ignored him just long enough to drag another body half a foot deeper behind the rock. Drained. Not stupid. Just pinned. Nora dug into the private's chest with 2 fingers, chased heat and slick tissue, and found the bullet wedged ugly between torn muscle and shattered rib. She pulled it free in one red slip and let it hit the dirt beside her knee. The man made a wet animal noise. She jammed a thumb against the wound, reached for the decompression setup, then changed her mind and drove the field drill where she needed speed more than grace. The noise of it went through her teeth. Air vented with a sick hiss. His chest dropped a fraction. Better. Not good. Never good. She tracked the rib pattern again, following the angle of the break instead of the entry hole, because entry holes lied, and broken bone usually did not. His blood was sticky already, thickening in the heat. A spent casing rolled against her boot. Somewhere upslope, stone chipped again and peppered the back of her collar with sharp dust. 45-degree downward track. Bone shattered inward. Armour piercing, 7.62. Shooter at 11 o'clock. Elevation, 400 metres. Hand me that gauze. He has 40 seconds before his pressure bottoms out. She said it, like weather, not drama. One ranger shoved gauze into her palm without asking how a medic in an iodine-stained blouse was reading terminal ballistics off a busted rib cage in the middle of a firefight. The answer could wait. Survival usually made room for curiosity later. If later showed up. Nora packed the wound, felt blood push hot through the weave, and listened through the noise. Not the shooting. The pattern behind it. Bursts from low left, single disciplined cracks from high ground. Somebody on the ridge knew exactly where their cover ended. Wade kept yelling retreat vectors into the handset. Too loud. Too many acronyms. Trying to bully physics into changing its mind. Then the long rifle they actually needed went silent. Nora looked right in time to see the ranger marksman jerk backward as if a hook had yanked his helmet string. The back of his skull burst against the stone in a dark spray. She did not need binoculars. The wound told the whole ugly story. Broken bone always pointed straight back to the bastard who pulled the trigger. The squad did not panic. That was the part civilians never got. Terror came later, if there was time for it. One man rolled the dead sniper flat and reached for the rifle. Another laid down, blind, suppressive fire that brought exactly nothing except noise. Their range advantage had just gone out through the back of a skull, and everybody knew it. The private under Nora's hands was still alive, but barely. She cinched pressure, checked his pupils, counted the pulse hammering thin under his jaw, and came up with the same number she already knew. 40 seconds, maybe less, unless somebody broke the geometry of this ambush. She stripped off one bloody glove, then the other, peeling them inside out with a wet slap. Her thumb found the biometric cuff at her wrist by habit, rubbing the edge the way some people touched rosary beads. Red LEDs blinked through blood smears and dust. Wade was still barking for movement, for withdrawal, for somebody to drag the casualties and save the mission at the same time. Nice wish. Physics, blood loss, and elevation had voted no. Around her, rifle fire cracked off the valley walls. In front of her, the dead sniper's M2010 lay half a body length away. Nora kept staring at the cuff until the noise of the battle seemed to narrow around that little red light. Nora kept staring at the red LEDs until Wade's voice cut across the rock like a saw blade. He wanted a pullback route. Casualty math. Something clean enough to say into a radio and ugly enough to leave the private bleeding where he lay. The cuff dug into her wrist, sticky with blood under the housing. She braced her thumb against the seam and twisted. The band did not give. It bit back. Then the composite shell snapped with a little crack that she felt more in the bones of her forearm than in her hand. Shock hit a heartbeat later. White heat ran from her wrist to her shoulder and locked her jaw hard enough that she bit through her lower lip. Copper filled her mouth. The LEDs flashed from red to frantic green. Burned plastic hit the air, sweet and nasty. A clipped synthetic tone chirped twice. Then a flat machine voice spilled out of the broken cuff. Rogue asset. Rogue asset. She tore the dead weight free and flung half of it into the gravel. The private behind her made a drowning sound that kept bad time with the gunfire. That was the whole argument in one noise. Wade turned on her so fast his boots skidded on dust. Vance. What the hell are you doing to military property? His face had gone the pale grey men got when control slipped away by inches instead of all at once. He was not wrong. She had just turned an operational suspension order into a felony with witnesses, telemetry, and probably a timestamp already riding a satellite link towards some climate-controlled office back home. Nora wiped blood from her mouth with the back of one hand and looked past him to the sniper's body. The M2010 lay trapped under a dead arm, stock chipped, scope webbed with cracks and clotting blood. Their only long gun, their only chance. She dropped flat and crawled. Basalt ripped through the knees of her pants and shaved skin off her forearms in hot little lines. Rounds cracked high now. Hunting movement. Good. That meant the shooters still owned the ridge and assumed nobody down here was stupid enough to contest it. Wade kept shouting legal language after her. Articles. Charges. The miserable hymn book of men who thought the rules still had hands. Retreat sounded noble on a map. Out here it meant dragging meat uphill under precision fire and pretending abandonment had a cleaner name. The dead ranger was still warm. Nora pried the rifle free, felt the sling snag on his plate carrier, and yanked until something tore loose with a dry pop. The scope glass looked finished at first glance. Spiderweb fractures, powder grit, a thumbprint of blood-dried tacky across the lens. She pulled an alcohol packet from her med pouch with her teeth, ripped it, and wiped in slow circles until the worst of the grime came away. Not fixed, just readable if she was honest and desperate enough at the same time. Which, lucky her, she was. She tore open a Tegaderm dressing, stretched the clear film over the cracked objective, then added a second strip crosswise to hold the first one tight. Improvised optics. Ugly medicine for ugly equipment. The alcohol smell cut through blood and powder for half a second and took her straight back to who she was supposed to be. Then the ridge cracked again, and that illusion died on schedule. Behind her, the wounded private coughed, and somebody cursed because the sound was still alive. Wade dropped beside her, breathing hard through anger. He tried to grab the barrel. She shoved his hand off without looking at him. "Shut your mouth and feed the mag, Lieutenant." The sentence landed like a slap because it was one. For a second he did nothing. Nora could almost hear the rank inside him grinding against reality. Then another bullet slapped, sparks off the basalt, 6 feet to their left, and the equation changed. He swore, tore a magazine from the dead sniper's rig, and shoved it toward her so hard it jammed into her shoulder. Better. Useful was always prettier than offended. Nora seated the mag, checked the bolt, and settled the stock into the hollow of her bruised shoulder. The rifle smelled of hot oil, blood, and sun-cooked nylon. The broken cuff at her wrist pulsed one last green blink before dying completely. Too late. The ping was gone from the bracelet because it was already somewhere else now, running ahead of them through military networks that never forgot a sin. Felony. Court-martial. Leavenworth. A file with her name on it, in all capital letters. Around them, the Rangers pressed lower behind the basalt, waiting for somebody to become the answer. Nora gave them one, even if it came wrapped in broken polymer and a prison sentence. She put all of that where she put pain, which was nowhere useful until later. She pressed her cheek to the taped scope. The rest of the world ceased to exist. Nothing left but cracked glass, heat shimmer, and a jagged black ridgeline. Nora settled behind the rifle and learned, in about half a second, exactly how much trust a dead man's weapon deserved. The taped scope gave her a bent slice of ridgeline, cracked glass veining the view like old ice. Heat shimmer climbed off the basalt and made everything breathe when it should have stayed still. Then one of them showed himself. Not much, just a brow, one eye, and the dark edge of a rifle, quick and professional. She took the shot, because waiting longer meant giving him the initiative. The trigger broke clean. The stock drove into the bruise already forming in her shoulder. Downrange, the round struck low and left, kicking sparks and dust off rock a good 2 meters short of the target. Miss. A bad one. The target vanished behind the rock instantly. A rifle barrel slid back out almost at once, angling toward her hide. Fair reaction. If somebody skipped around under her chin, she would return the favor too. Nora tasted old blood from the split in her lip and kept the rifle up. The M2010 was off zero. Not slightly. Enough to bury her if she lied to herself about it. She worked the bolt without rushing it. Fast hands mattered in surgery. Behind a scope, fast hands mostly got people killed. She drew a breath through her nose and counted. 4. Held it. 4. Let it out slow. 4. Empty. 4 again. Box breathing. Not magic. Just a way to drag her pulse back under her own command before adrenaline made a mess of the math. Around her, the valley separated into usable pieces. Dust lifting off the ridge. Warm wind on her cheek. Sound arriving in layers. Then it came. Crack first. Sharp and vicious. Then the slower thump of the rifle report rolling down from high ground. She counted the delay in the space behind her teeth. Crack. Thump. Air doing arithmetic. Rock doing the rest. About 650. Near enough? She nudged the turret. Click. Click. Dry little sounds under her fingertips. Mill dots floated over the ridge, while she held the correction in her head and kept her breathing even. Wade slid down beside her, face grey with grit and anger, and finally said something useful. Docks on the rifle. Feed her mags. 3 and 4. Suppressing fire. 2 o'clock. Better. A lot better. Rage had finally found a job. The Rangers moved like trained men who recognized a workable solution. No staring. No movie nonsense. One shoved a fresh magazine against Nora's elbow. 2 more opened up at 2 o'clock. Not trying to score kills, just forcing the ridge to keep its head down for a borrowed second. Suppressive fire changed the whole texture of the air. Not safer, just busier. Nora held on the same patch of basalt and waited. The shooter came back slower this time. Barrel first, then half a cheek. He was trying to find the woman who had missed him. Reasonable. She gave herself one shorter cycle. In. Hold. Out. Hold. Her heartbeat dropped out of her throat and back into her chest where it belonged. She held 1/2 mil high, a touch right, then pressed through the trigger instead of slapping at it. The rifle kicked. The cracked lens flashed white. Then the image came back in time for her to see the man's head burst against the stone behind him. No flourish. No drama. One moment intact, the next ruined. The crack thump echo reached her after he was already dead. Somebody behind her drew in a breath, but nobody said a word about heroics. They had all seen what it really was. A correction. A second chance. Physics finally landing on the right side. The ridge went quiet in a way that felt worse than gunfire. Nora ran the bolt and kept searching for another forehead. Another elbow. Another stupid inch of exposed skin. Nothing. The men up there had learned fast. Full cover now. Blind spots only. No more testing angles. Wade saw it too and passed her another magazine without needing the lesson repeated. Somewhere left of her, the wounded private made a wet, choking sound that cut through everything and reminded her this was still triage, just with a longer tool. One ranger started calling sectors in a clipped working voice. Another shifted to cover her flank. Discipline had come back into the squad like current returning to a wire. Useful. Human. Nora kept her cheek against the stock and watched the empty ridge through cracked glass. Warm wind brushed her face, carrying sulphur, dust, and the smell of metal striking stone. No flashes. No movement. Then even the random fire stopped. That was the tell. The valley went dead silent. Dead men stopped shooting, and smart ones did too, right before they changed tactics. Nora kept her eye glued to the cracked glass, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The firing stopped so hard it felt unnatural, like the valley had put a hand over its own mouth. Nora stayed on the scope and found nothing she could use. No muzzle flash, no shoulder shift, no careless inch of forehead. The PMC shooters had folded deep into blind pockets behind the ridge, full cover, disciplined enough not to offer her the courtesy of a bad angle. Smart. Irritating, but smart. Wind came through the cut in the valley, hot and abrasive, slapping grit against her face and lifting dust off the basalt in thin spirals. Jet blast drift off the terrain. She lowered the muzzle a fraction and watched the dust instead of the men. Dust lied less. The little columns leaned left, straightened, then kicked again near the upper ledge where the hidden nests sat. Sulphur rode the gusts with the baked smell of stone and old powder. Her shoulder ached from the last shot. Her lip still tasted like copper. Behind her, the rangers stayed low and quiet, nylon creaking when somebody shifted weight. Nobody asked what she was doing. They were past curiosity now. Waiting on her was not faith. It was simple battlefield math. A clean line was gone. That Left angles, surfaces, and whatever the wind was willing to give her. Nora let the scope drift above the hidden positions and found a slab of basalt hanging over the nest line at a slant, one face shaved hard and smooth by old breaks. About 30 degrees, maybe a touch more. Hard rock, hard enough to punish a round instead of swallowing it. She stared at that slab until the geometry started arranging itself. Too square, and the bullet would die there. Too shallow, and it would skip useless into open ground. She needed an ugly strike, one that would burst jacket, core, and stone together into a sideways fan. The back of the neck was the weak place. Plates did not cover it. Men trusted that gap without thinking about it. She tracked the wind again through the dust spirals, reading the sideways shove in pulses instead of a steady push. Click, click. The turret spoke in tiny, dry sounds. The rifle felt warmer now, oil thinning in the heat. She settled the stock, found the angle through cracked glass, and waited for one gust that lined up instead of fighting her. Not luck, just acceptable physics under bad conditions. She fired at the rock. Anybody missing half the equation would have called it crazy. Recoil hit the bruise in her shoulder hard enough to light it up white. The round struck basalt with a flat metallic smash that was all wrong for flesh. Then the stone spat. A spray of fragments ripped down into the blind pocket below, screaming through the air in a high, vicious hiss. Not one impact. Several. Sharp, wet sounds buried under the shrapnel noise. Nora saw a gloved hand claw at empty air. Then one body rolled partly out of cover, chin collapsed to chest, blood pumping dark from the base of the skull. A second shape jerked backward so violently its boots kicked into open space before it dropped out of view. She did not admire the shot. She worked the bolt and checked for movement, already sorting result from consequence. 2 down, maybe instantly dead, maybe dying fast enough that the difference no longer mattered. The ridge answered with a burst of blind return fire that went nowhere near her. Good. They had not expected the rock to betray them. One ranger let out half a laugh and killed it immediately, professional enough to know this was not magic. It was a solution with a short shelf life. Then the valley gave her a new sound. Not a rifle crack, not the whip of rounds overhead. A dry, hollow cough from deeper behind the ridge. Hoomp. She froze for one beat, because recognition moved faster than thought. Poomp. Again, spaced out a little more evenly this time. Mortar. 60mm, if her nerves were still calling things straight, and they usually did when the day got ugly. Dust trembled along the upper slope, where the launch signatures puffed and vanished. Heavy weapon, smart escalation. Rifles had failed, so now they were reaching for something that did not care about cover geometry or breath control. Behind her, the squad changed shape all at once, men flattening lower, hands grabbing gear. Somebody muttering a grid that nobody had time to use. Nora kept the scope up 1 second longer anyway, making sure the blind pocket stayed dead. No movement. Good enough? She pulled back and the wind hit her eyes full of grit and powder stink. Another tube coughed somewhere beyond the ridge. Poomp. The dry sound echoed down the rocks. The rifle fight was over. Now they were just waiting for the sky to fall. The first mortar round came in with a rising shriek that made everybody flatten before the blast even hit. Then the valley kicked upward. Dirt, splinters, broken brush, stone. The concussion slammed Nora's chest and drove grit into her teeth hard enough to crunch. Basalt fragments rattled off the rocks around them. Somebody to her left screamed for cover, which was a little late and not especially helpful. A second tube coughed somewhere beyond the ridge. She knew the timing now. Poomp in the distance, then that ugly hanging second where the air seemed to wait and decide whose problem it would become. The next explosion ripped open a scrub tree 30 yards downslope and sent its branches cartwheeling through the dust like broken bones with leaves still attached. The rangers stayed low and moved the way trained men moved under indirect fire, ugly and practical, elbows and knees, dragging gear in close. Nobody stood up to be brave. Nobody wasted breath on speeches. Nora shoved the rifle under her body and kept her face down against stone hot enough to sting. The whole hillside smelled like scorched dirt, sulphur, and old metal. Every blast changed the terrain a little more, chewing craters where there had been solid ground seconds ago. Then she noticed something wrong with it. Not the mortars themselves, the placement. The first impact had landed wide. The second had walked the line closer, but not toward the most crowded patch of cover. Away from it. Nora lifted her head just enough to track the pattern through the dust. Wade's spare comms bag still lay where he had dropped it earlier, just beyond the basalt slab that anchored their position. Dark fabric half buried, straps twisted in the dirt. The mortar impacts were bracketing everything around that rock, while leaving a clean wedge untouched beside it, about 15 degrees off where any competent crew should have tightened the spread. Not random, not sloppy, intentional. The shelling was herding them without touching that bag. That thought slid into place cold and clean and filed itself where she could use it later, if later happened. Another launch cough rolled down from the ridge. Nora counted without meaning to. The squad hugged closer to the ground. Wade was shouting into a handset, words shredded by blast pressure and static. The next round came in lower, fast enough that the scream barely had time to finish before the earth burst open near them and turned the air into knives. The third explosion hit close enough to erase normal sound. 1 second Wade was crouched behind the rock, one hand on the radio. The next, the shockwave shoved him sideways, and a spray of dark blood snapped out from his thigh in hard rhythmic pulses. Not seepage. Not a bad flesh wound. Arterial. The fragment had torn through the armor panel at the top of his leg like Kevlar was wet paper. A razor of shrapnel flashed once in Nora's memory before vanishing into the dirt. Wade hit the ground on his back, jaw hanging open in stunned silence before the pain found him. Then it did. He clamped both hands over the wound, uselessly, and the blood still punched through his fingers in bright jets timed to his heartbeat. Every pulse cost him another measure of life. The smell changed right there. Fresh iron, hotter and sweeter than the general battlefield stink. One ranger crawled toward him and got knocked flat again by a rain of falling dirt from the shattered lip of the crater. Another kept his head down and kept firing blind toward the ridge, because stopping altogether felt too much like dying. Nora was already moving. Not dramatic, just immediate. Rifle down, body low, brain switching tracks from ballistic angles to blood volume and time to empty. She slid in beside Wade and tore open what was left of her med pouch with one hand. Gauze wrappers, empty sleeves, a half-used pressure bandage soaked through from the private on the rocks. Nothing with enough clean material left to matter. She checked anyway because habits outlived hope. The wound in Wade's thigh was a torn red mouth, chewing blood into the dirt. Each pulse came strong, then weaker, then strong again, as if his body was arguing with itself about whether to keep going. He tried to say something and only managed a raw animal sound. Nora pressed hard above the wound and felt the artery hammer against her palm like it was trying to escape. The bleeding slowed for half a beat, then pushed through around her hand. Too deep for fingers, too fast for improvising with scraps. Another mortar tube coughed in the distance. Poomp! Somebody nearby was yelling they were out of smoke. Somebody else was yelling for a corpsman, which had a certain bitter charm since the corpsman was already there, elbow deep in a lieutenant. Nora looked once toward the untouched wedge beside the basalt where Wade's dropped comms bag still lay safe in the dirt, and the seed of that wrongness dug in deeper. Then she looked back at the wound and did the math she hated, because it was usually right. 60 seconds. Tops. Her medkit was just bloody wrappers now. Wade's blood kept pulsing through her fingers in slick, hot bursts, slipping right past her grip. Nora dropped into the crater beside Wade and ripped his pant leg open from knee to hip. The fabric gave in jerks, threads snapping wet against blood and dirt. Underneath, the wound looked worse without the cloth pretending otherwise. Shrapnel had carved a torn channel through the upper thigh and opened the artery deep inside it. Blood came out in hot bursts, each one jumping against her wrist with the force of his failing pulse. Wade tried to push himself up and nearly blacked out doing it. His face had gone the color of dust. His eyes were too wide. Shock was already setting hooks in. Nora reached for gauze again out of reflex and came up with wrappers, empties, and one ruined bandage soaked dark from earlier work. Nothing left worth calling medical supply. The M2010 lay across her lap, barrel dark and ugly and hot from the rounds she had just sent through it. Heat rolled off it hard enough for her to feel it on her cheek. She did not think long. Thinking long was how people bled out. She tore a leather retention strap off Wade's gear, doubled it and shoved it between his teeth before he could ask why. Bite down hard. You spit this out, you will bite your own tongue off. He stared at her for one split second and understood exactly enough to be afraid. Then he started fighting, not strategically, just humanly. He shook his head once and tried to spit the leather free. Nora grabbed his jaw and forced it shut with blood-slick fingers. Keep it in. Another distant mortar cough rolled down the valley. Pump. They did not have the luxury of easing into anything. She shifted the rifle, testing the barrel with the back of her hand, and feeling the heat bloom up instantly, vicious and dry. Hot enough. Too hot, probably. The kind of heat that lifted the oil smell off steel and carried it with the stink of powder into the back of her throat. Wade saw where she was looking, and panic finally broke all the way through the officer in him. He tried to crawl backward using one elbow, dragging the ruined leg an inch before the pain bent him double. The leather strap muffled the first scream into a ragged grunt. Nora pinned his hips with her weight, one forearm across his pelvis, and found the wound track again through the blood. She did not need precision here. She needed enough pressure, enough heat, and a little luck from biology. Above them, the crater lip shed dirt in soft streams. Around them, the battle kept going in chopped fragments, rifles cracking, men shouting sectors, another mortar tube getting ready to drop the next piece of sky on them. She pressed the barrel into the wound. Wade arched so hard his shoulders came off the ground. The sound that tore out of him was not really a scream at first, more like his whole body trying to leave through his throat and getting stuck there. Then the leather caught it and turned it into a wet, strangled howl. The steel hit blood and tissue with a violent sizzle that seemed far too loud for something happening inside one man's leg. Burned copper, powder residue, and the thick, black stink of cooking flesh slammed into Nora's face so hard her stomach tried to turn over. She locked her elbow and held the barrel in place, while Wade bucked under her like a man having a seizure. His hands clawed at the dirt, then at her sleeve, then at nothing. The artery fought back for 2 pulses, blood snapping against the hot steel in bright spatters. Then the flow changed. Less spray. More bubbling hiss. His whole body shook in little tearing spasms. The barrel made a faint, brittle sound under the thermal shock, a tiny crack she felt through the stock more than heard. Metal protesting. Good to know. Not useful now. Wade's eyes rolled white for a second, focused again, then unfocused completely. His heels drummed twice against the crater floor and stopped. The smell got worse before it got better. Human meat always did. Nora counted 2 beats, then 3, and pulled the barrel back. Smoke curled thinly off the wound. The blood had stopped leaping. What came out now was slower, darker, not the hard arterial jets that killed inside a minute. Wade sagged sideways with the leather still jammed between his teeth, chest fluttering in shallow, uneven breaths. Alive. Unconscious, probably. Maybe mercifully. Nora yanked the strap free before he choked on it and checked the side of his neck with 2 fingers. Pulse present. Fast. Weak. But there. She set the rifle across her thighs and looked at the barrel. Even through the dirt and heat shimmer, she could see it was not right anymore. Not visibly bent like scrap. Worse than that. A tiny warp. The kind that ruined trust. Another mortar cough sounded beyond the ridge. Poomp. Closer this time. Or maybe she was just running out of optimism. She grabbed the rifle and rose into a crouch at the lip of the crater, face still slick with Wade's blood and the sweat the heat had ripped out of her. Below her, Wade lay alive, because she had just cauterized him with the only precision weapon they had left. Above her, the Mortar crew was walking rounds in for the finish. The M2010 lay across her lap. It was still a gun, sure. But the thermal shock had warped the barrel just enough to turn every shot at range into a blind gamble. The rifle was no longer an honest instrument. Nora knew it the second she settled behind it again. The barrel had taken the heat and the blood and come out of it changed, not visibly ruined, just wrong in the small, expensive way that mattered at 700 meters. She rolled the windage knob with her thumb until it started clicking like a dry insect under her nail. Click, click, click. She kept going until the adjustment hit the edge of what the sight could forgive. The motion felt obscene, cranking correction into a weapon that had already told her it was bent. Around her, the valley had gone into that post-blast quiet that was never peace, just men reloading and math catching up. The Mortar crew was still out there, hidden low behind rock where direct fire would waste rounds and time. Her bruised shoulder throbbed with each breath. The air smelled like burned propellant, cauterized flesh, and pulverized dirt. Wade lay half-conscious in the crater behind her, alive for the moment because she had cooked his artery shut with the same rifle now pressed into her collarbone. She watched the slope through fractured glass and admitted the obvious. A damaged gun at this distance did not win clean. It needed help, or bait. Same thing, depending on who got fed to it. She found the smoke grenade on a ranger's vest, yanked the pin with her teeth, and moved before anybody could stop her. The open rock ahead offered no real cover, just a shallow lip and a lot of bad ideas. She rolled out onto it anyway, body low, knees and elbows banging hard against basalt. Heat came off the stone into her palms. Fragments of old shell casings bit through the fabric at her forearms. She threw the grenade, not where instinct wanted it, but 10 degrees left of the likely Mortar hide, just enough to make the plume drift across the wrong slice of ground. The canister clattered, spun, and hissed. White smoke climbed fast, then got pushed sideways by the valley wind into a ragged curtain. Nora flattened behind the smallest rise she could find and waited with the rifle laid into the crook of her shoulder. The trick was simple enough to be ugly. Men fixated under stress. Give them a visible target. A female body out in the open, smoke half covering it, and somebody down there might decide he wanted the satisfying shot instead of the disciplined one. Not because he was stupid, because tunnel vision made stupid out of competent men all the time. She slowed her breathing until each inhale barely lifted her chest. The rifle sight floated over the edge of the smoke. Somewhere behind it, the Mortar team would be straining to find her. Straining meant movement. Movement killed. Nothing happened for a few seconds, which was its own kind of violence. Smoke dragged low over the rock, torn into streamers by crosswind. Nora tracked the drift, adjusted half a hair, then held still enough for the ache in her shoulder to sharpen into something almost clean. A shape moved behind the veil. Not the whole man, just the top line of a helmet first, then higher, a little too high, searching above cover instead of through it. There it was. Target fixation. The loader wanted eyes on the exposed threat so badly, he gave away more of himself than the plates were meant to hide. His head rose past the Kevlar collar. Chin up, neck stretched, trying to see through smoke that was never meant to hide her from everybody, only from him. Nora let the world narrow. No speeches in her head. No memories. Just broken sight picture, wind drift, barrel warp, and the small, raw fact of a human skull at range. She took one last shallow breath and stopped on the natural pause. The trigger pressed back smooth as bone. Recoil drove into the bruise in her shoulder so hard her teeth clicked together. For an instant the cracked scope flashed white and useless. Then the image returned, and the loader's head came apart above the smoke in a dark, wet burst. The body dropped out of view so fast it looked yanked downward. No flourish, no cinematic last stand, just a system failure in flesh. The valley did not cheer. It inhaled. That was what the end of a firefight sounded like when nobody trusted it yet. Nora ran the bolt on reflex and held the scope on the nest, waiting for the second man. The correction shot, the return burst, anything. Nothing came back. No mortar cough. No rifle crack. No movement but smoke unravelling in the wind and settling over rock that had finally decided to stay still. Behind her, somebody muttered a sector check. Somebody else answered, and then even those voices died off. The ambush site had gone dead in the blunt mechanical way of a machine with its last moving part punched out. Nora stayed in position until the muscles at the back of her neck started to lock. Only then did she lower the rifle. The silence pressing over the valley felt heavier than the shelling had. Powder stink hung over everything. So did the greasy trace of burned blood from Wade's leg and the sharper medicinal smell of the kit she no longer had enough of. The physical fight was over. That much was obvious. But the untouched patch of dirt around Wade's dropped bag sat there in the settling dust like a bright red flag. The ambush had not been random. It had been surgical. Once the valley stayed quiet long enough to believe in it, the work changed shape. Nora rose from the rock in a slow crouch, rifle still in hand, and started moving through what was left of the ambush. No rush now. Rush was for incoming fire. Clean-up needed eyes. One ranger covered the upper slope, while another crawled to Wade's crater to check if the lieutenant was still alive enough to be a problem later. Nora crossed the broken ground toward the last mortar position, boots slipping in loose dirt that had been churned by shell bursts and blood. The loader lay twisted against the rocks, with most of the back of his head gone, and one arm tucked under him like sleep had taken him badly. His web gear was slick with dust, sweat, and the dark, wet shine of recent death. Nora rolled him over with her boot first, then with the rifle barrel when he stayed convincingly dead. In a pouch near his chest, she found a handheld unit the size of a brick, black casing, rubberized edges, red LEDs, blinking in a tight-coded rhythm. Not a radio, exactly. Not anything field-expedient, either. A frequency detector, or part of one. The little screen pulsed with an encrypted band ID that repeated at fixed intervals. She stared at it and felt something old inside her tighten. Then her mind slid back to the mortar pattern, the untouched wedge beside the basalt, the way the rounds had walked around Wade's dropped bag like they had been ordered to respect it. That was enough. She turned and went straight for the spare comms bag lying where it had landed earlier, still half sheltered by the rock the shells had carefully avoided. No instinct about it. No magic hunch. Just a line of evidence dragging her by the collar. The bag was dust-coated and nicked by stone, but otherwise too intact for a position that had been pounded this hard. Nora slung the rifle and pulled her knife. The blade went through the fabric in one ugly rip. She cut the side open wide, shoved aside spare batteries, a bundled handset cable, a field notebook damp with somebody's sweat, and hit a hard case buried underneath, black polymer, heavy for its size. She pulled it free and almost dropped it because the surface was slippery with transferred blood from her hands. A tiny recessed screen woke when she thumbed it, red light flooding the shade under the basalt. The code running across it matched the handheld unit in her other hand so cleanly it made her stomach go cold. Same pulse pattern, same encrypted band, same timing. Synchronization so perfect it looked intimate. She held the two devices side by side and watched the red indicators blink together like paired heartbeats. One pinging, one listening. There it was. Not a navigation error. Not bad luck. A beacon and a hunter built to talk to each other across a battlefield full of expendable people. She wiped dirt from the casing with the heel of her palm and found the serial burned into the polymer under the screen. DRP-7. A phantom ache flared in her chest, sharp and cold. The letters hit before the number even fully registered. Her breath stopped for one clean second. DRP. She knew that prefix. Knew the procurement language, the buried acronyms, the kind of sanitized paperwork that called baiting human beings a test environment. DRP-7 had been a DARPA lure architecture, ghost-rumoured, then denied, then buried under classification after a Tier 1 team got chewed up in the mountains because someone higher up wanted clean signal capture on an enemy network. Her old team, The one she never discussed because saying their names out loud did nothing except prove memory could still draw blood. She stared at the red digits until the valley around her blurred at the edges. Same family. Samilogic. Same stink of people in air-conditioned rooms writing off operators as acceptable loss if the telemetry looked good. Behind her, Wade made a rough sound from the crater, halfway back to consciousness and none of the way ready for this. Nora walked to him fast, dropped to one knee, and threw the black box into the center of his chest hard enough to make him grunt. Look at the serial number. You guys were sacrificial lambs. We were dead before we even left the wire. His eyes were foggy with pain, then sharpened when they found the red code on the screen. Confusion hit first, then the slower, uglier recognition that he had never been told enough to consent to any of this. The rangers nearest them heard the tone of her voice and stopped pretending not to listen. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed one. Nora held up the detector from the dead mercenary and let its red blink answer the beacon's pulse in perfect time. The proof was right there. Ugly and electronic. Wade looked from one device to the other, jaw tight despite the shock and blood loss, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked less like an officer and more like a man who had just seen the floor open under his own chain of command. He started to say something, maybe deny it, maybe ask who had planted the thing, but the valley beat him to it. A low chopping thud rolled in from far off, heavy rotors punching the air apart. Not light scout traffic. Bigger. Meaner. The sound built fast, shouldering over the silence until dust trembled on the crater lip and loose brush began to shake. Black Hawk. Nora did not need to see it yet to know that. Extraction, if you were being charitable. Cleanup, if you had lived long enough to stop being charitable. The physical fight had ended with a dead mortar crew and quiet rock. This was different. This was paperwork with turbine blades, men in clean gear, and somebody arriving to decide which survivors counted as evidence. Nora tightened her grip on the beacon until its blood-slick casing almost slipped free again. The red DRP-7 serial burned in the shade while the Black Hawk flared over the ridgeline, turbines screaming, right on its goddamn schedule. The Black Hawk came in low and mean, rotors chopping the valley air into a pressure wave that shoved dust across the rocks and flattened the last threads of smoke. No medevac markings, no tail flash, no Red Cross, just a matte, dark body dropping onto the broken slope like it had been waiting just over the horizon for permission to exist. Nora stood where she was with the warped M2010 hanging in one hand and the blood-slick beacon in the other, and watched the aircraft settle on its struts while hot jet fuel stink rolled over the LZ and buried the older smells underneath. Blood, burned powder, cooked flesh, all of it got shoved into the background by turbine exhaust and bureaucracy. The side door opened before the bird had fully planted. 4 people came out in dark tactical suits that had all the softness of office furniture designed by a prison architect. No aid bags, no litter. No one even looked toward the crater where Wade was bleeding through a field, dressing and trying not to pass back out. One of the rangers cursed under his breath. Another started to rise, then thought better of it when Nora gave him the smallest shake of her head. The physical part was over. These people had brought a different weapon system. The one in front moved with the confidence of somebody who had already read the report and decided everyone else was a footnote. Clean gloves. Sidearm still holstered. No rifle, because he did not need one. He stepped straight toward Nora, then past her, eyes falling on the detector in her left hand and the beacon in her right, as if they mattered more than the bodies cooling around them. He crouched, took the detector from the dirt where a ranger had dropped it, compared the blink pattern to the beacon screen, and only then gave Nora his full attention. His face did not harden. It did not soften either. It just arranged itself into that dead federal calm that usually meant paperwork was about to do violence for him. "Rogue asset ping reached command 14 minutes ago," he said, almost conversationally, as if explaining a delayed package. There it was. Not coincidence. Not divine timing. The bracelet she had snapped back at the rocks had lit the signal fire in Scene 2, and the system had answered exactly like systems did when one of their tagged animals bit through the leash. He slipped the beacon into a hard case without asking permission, then reached inside his jacket and drew out a pair of steel cuffs. Number 8s. Real ones. The metal looked dull and cold in the rotor wash. Bureaucracy had texture after all. Nora Vance, he said, raising his voice just enough to carry through the rotor thump without turning it into a shout. You are under arrest for the destruction of military biometric property, violating an operational suspension, and the unauthorized killing of foreign nationals during a classified operation. No drama in it, no triumph. Just clauses stacked on clauses, built to land heavier than bullets. He did not mention the dead Mortar crew by name. He did not mention the wounded private or Wade, or the ambush or the DRP-7 Beacon humming in his case. Those things complicated the sentence, and men like him preferred clean paperwork. Nora looked at the cuffs first, then at his hand, then at the ranger nearest Wade, who was holding pressure on the dressing with both palms and trying not to watch this part. The cuffs were close enough now that she could hear them knock softly against each other when the helicopter buffeted his wrist. She understood the rest of the math without anyone spelling it out. If a ranger lunged, this became resistance. If she forced a scene, it became obstruction layered over felony. If shots got fired now, everyone who had survived the ambush would die inside an affidavit written by people who had never touched dirt. She felt the last magazine seated in the M2010 and knew it was meaningless. The rifle was bent. The case was already built. The valley had merely been where they staged the evidence, so she made the only move left that protected people who still had a future worth ruining. Nora thumbed the magazine release and caught the mag as it dropped, muscle memory so smooth it looked bored. She worked the bolt once, let the last round eject into the dust, and laid both pieces on the rock before tossing the rifle after them. Metal hit stone with a flat, tired clack. Then she raised her hands, blood dark under the nails, powder smudged across the backs, dried iodine caught in the cracks of her skin from a lifetime she was apparently done paying for. The chief agent stepped in and turned her wrist over. The steel touched her skin with a cold, rough scrape that felt almost absurd after everything else this day had put through her body. No tears, no speech, no appeal to justice from a woman smart enough to know justice had never boarded that helicopter. She held still while the cuff ratcheted shut around one wrist, then the other, each click small and final. Around her, the rotor wash slapped at uniforms and stirred the smell of hot fuel over the kill site. One of the rangers made a sound like he wanted to say her name and swallowed it instead. Good. Quiet dignity was not cinematic. It was simply the refusal to make their job easier by begging. Nora kept her eyes dead ahead. The cold steel ratcheted tight around her wrists. Click, click. Marcus Wade got upright because staying down had started to feel like consent. The leg did not agree. The burned bandage around his thigh had gone stiff with blood, and every time he put weight on it, the cauterized artery felt like somebody had hidden a strip of hot wire under the skin and yanked it tight. He used the crater wall, then a ranger's shoulder, then finally his own anger. By the time he straightened, the CIA man already had Nora half-turned with the cuffs on her wrists and the Black Hawk still beating the valley flat behind him. Wade looked past the pain long enough to see what mattered. Nora standing silent with blood and soot on her hands. The chief agent holding that silence like it was signed property. 8 of his rangers still breathing, battered and filthy, and watching him for direction because habit survived shellfire. Wade gave them one sharp hand signal, nothing theatrical, just work. The sound came back at once, 8 M4 bolts going forward in a hard metallic chain that carried even through the rotor thunder. Clack, 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 clack. The squad stepped into line between Nora and the agency men, barrels lowered at 45 degrees like doctrine, not threat. A barrier, not a firing squad. Professional enough to keep the safety on the right side of history, clear enough to make the point anyway. Nobody cried. Nobody said they owed her. Respect had already happened in blood and smoke. This was just paperwork, wearing boots. The chief agent turned, measured the line, and recalculated his afternoon. Wade could see it happen. Not fear. Administrative drag. Political splash radius. Dead rangers in a classified valley were survivable if the paperwork stayed narrow. Arresting the medic who had saved the squad while 8 living witnesses stood there with rifles and names and parents and congressional districts attached to them was a different problem. Wade reached into his chest pocket and pulled free the folded operations order he had carried all day, until sweat and blood made it feel like cloth. The paper was wrinkled, damp, and almost soft at the corners. He braced it against his plate carrier, pressed 2 fingers to the dressing on his thigh until fresh blood welled, then smeared that blood across the signature line because ink was a luxury the moment did not deserve. His hand shook once, not from nerves, from blood loss, then steadied. He signed over the stain. Field Command Override. Title 10 Authority invoked the ugly way, with a body that looked like hell and legal language that finally had a use other than ruining good people. He held the order out, fingers red to the knuckle. I am the Title 10 Grid Commander. Dr. Vance acted under my direct orders to protect military assets. If you want to put her in cuffs, you will have to arrest this entire squad for carrying out a summary execution. The rotor wash snapped at the paper, but he did not let it go. Let the bastard take it or refuse it. Either choice left fingerprints. Nobody moved for a long second except the helicopter blades. The chief agent's face stayed calm, which in men like him usually meant the shouting was internal. He looked at the signed order, at Wade's leg, at the line of rangers holding formation with their muzzles down and their eyes flat, then at Nora standing cuffed and unreadable behind them. This was the problem with systems. Every once in a while they ran into another system, pointed the opposite way. He stepped forward, took the paper, scanned it once, and glanced toward one of his own people by the aircraft. Silent consultation. Silent answer. He could still push it. Wade knew that. He could drag them all into detention, sort it out later, bury the context under classification and time. But later had witnesses now, and witnesses multiplied risk. The chief agent reached out, took the beacon case back from his subordinate, and finally nodded at the cuffs on Nora's wrists. One of his people stepped in and unlocked them without comment. The steel came free with a small dry snap. The agent did not apologize. Men like him never did. He tucked the override order into his jacket, took the beacon, and backed toward the Black Hawk as if retreat could be made to look procedural. It probably could. Everything could if you typed it into the right format. The Rangers never raised their rifles. They did not need to. Power had already bent. Not broken. Bent. That was all anybody got in a machine like this. A few weeks later, Nora sat alone in a rotten little bar outside the wire, where the tables rocked on uneven legs, and the television over the counter played a muted news crawl nobody trusted. Cheap malt liquor had replaced iodine in the air, though some of the antiseptics still lived in the cuffs of her jacket, and maybe always would. Her nursing credential had been revoked 3 days earlier by people who had never heard a bone drill scream or smelled a man cauterized with his own rifle. Permanent revocation. Administrative language for cutting off the part of her life she had still been trying to save. She drank anyway, not because the whiskey helped, but because ritual was cheaper than therapy and easier to carry. The stool beside her creaked. A stranger in civilian clothes did not sit down, did not make a production out of being mysterious, just slid a black envelope across the scarred wood and kept moving. No insignia outside. No return address. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, letters crisp and clean in a font chosen by somebody who thought menace should look expensive. We need a doctor who knows how to leave bodies behind, instead of just cleaning them up. Nora read it once, then again. Across the room, the TV ran a segment about procurement reform and overseas stability, while the bartender polished the same glass with a dirty rag and minded his business like a professional. She set the card back into the envelope and let one corner of her mouth lift. Not happiness. Nothing that stupid. Just recognition. The system had taken her license, buried the valley, and still found a way to ask for more. Nora finished the drink, palmed the envelope, and sat there a second longer in the smell of stale beer and old wood, looking at a piece of heavy stock paper that proved you could never really leave the wire. She finished the whiskey, set the empty glass on the scarred wood, and slid the black envelope into her jacket.